Hello everyone, today we discuss chivalric literature and we will read and comment a passage from Chrétien de Troyes romance, Cligès, which is one of the most famous works of the French poet and includes a lot of information of great interest for military history, medieval warfare, and naturally chivalric war and military culture, let's say, of the 12th century, substantially. And it's actually a very big topic to introduce. You know that Chrétien de Troyes lived in roughly the second half of the 12th century, is one of the greatest authors in chivalric literature. He was the beginner century of what we know as the Arthurian cycle in its structural forms in mature form. He revived this great interest that already existed partly towards the Arthurian legend and stylized it in the fashions of the times. Obviously, with all the anachronisms, like today we will see in fact how Cligès takes place, like all Arthurian romances, into Arthurian times, but the let's say the background, the environment, the context is the one that would be in the 12th century. And this is very fascinating, naturally, also because of the capacities of adaptation of medieval writers and this deep understanding. Actually, you don't have to think of the anachronism as a mistake or a meaningless or a diminishing character. On the contrary, that's actually an enormous opportunity that we have to read into the mind of and the spirit of a 12th century poet, and more broadly in what was important from a chivalric point of view. You know that in the Middle Ages we have mostly, especially when it comes to let's say mostly, depends on the cases, but it's the clergy that owns the historiographical monopolium, if you want. Not entirely, that it's not literally a monopolium, but especially in certain areas of Europe, this is particularly evident, right? And we rarely have, in fact, a secular tradition that tells us what was the perspective, for example, of knights, right? But there are works that actually shows that, and this is one of them that naturally, with great approximations we can interpret it in this way. Of course, at least it's a work in which we can find part of that. There are actually other sources that have been written by knights, sure, yes, there are, or members of knights' families, that discuss and show this great interest that exists, and in fact among secular, in the secular world, for this, not just the Arthurian cycle as such, but chivalric culture, its ethics, because it was largely fitting with not the reality. This is still an ideal, but it's exactly being an ideal that reveals to us what was, theoretically important for these people, what they wished reality was like. But what is interesting is that at the same time, however, we see also part of the reality, right? Part of the reality may be painted into, with brighter colors and with more attractive appearance, if you want, and more stylized and moralized, but there's a lot of truth behind this, and this the very same literary taste shows us partly what was plausible, at least in part, for what this military culture was. This is a video dedicated fundamentally to medieval knighthood. That I even created a playlist dedicated to it, and that I don't, let's say, add to very often, because it's somewhat difficult to discuss about knighthood. It would require a lot more of structured premises and backgrounding here. But I think here and there we can take all these small pieces of information, this evidence, and try to draw kind of a broader picture. The life and works of Chrétien de Troyes can be, think about. We know that in his young work, in his youth, he wrote this Philomena, that is the only work that has actually been survived, because it was preserved into the Ovid Moralisé. And then we know actually that he wrote another work known as Le Roi Mare et Dissolut la Blonde, that probably was an episode about the legend of Tristan, and that has been lost. And the romances of Chrétien that are Érec et Enide, the history of two bride and groom, and exemplar lovers whose happiness is eventually ruined by the doubt that Enide rendered coward the extremely valorous Érec, that also shines during their dangerous adventures. Then we have Cligès, we will be reading from today, that has this kind of oriental setting, and it's another example of this remarkable love that is also intertwined with the theme of the fake dead woman, in this case with Phénice, but we will see it now. Then there is Lancelot, ou Les Chevaliers à la Charrette, that celebrates instead the love with Lancelot for Guinevere, and the sacrifice of the knight that agrees to travel in this a wagon, which is a great symbol of shame. Then there is Yvain ou Les Chevaliers au Lion, Perceval ou Le Comte du Graal, which is unfinished, by the way. And to these 5 romances, also we have to add a poem, a shorter one on Guillaume d'Angleterre, and a group of songs, among the first that spread eventually into northern France, the courtly love, the loving ideal of the troubadour of Provence, of Occitane. And the importance of Chrétien de Troyes, that is this, if you want, easy narrator. I mean, he as we will see today, he goes very straight. It's a fluid story. It makes him so interesting, and sometimes it's long-winded and kind of rambling, right? Just like I am. I wish I was so rambling the way he was, like, at least, because I would definitely be way more interesting to be listened to. But all this was possible in him because he began and built the great loving romance and adventures that on the base of the Brittonic and Arthurian legends, and this is the greatness of the author, right? And Cligès is this courtly romance of 1176, into which the author tries to catch the interest of Henri le Libéral, Count of Champagne, and was one of the most powerful French nobles in absolute terms at the time. The County of Champagne had an enormous. Eventually, it would decline actually in the following century, etc. But it's important at this date because, and for what we were saying before about our understanding of what could be the interest of a great lord of France at the time, right? And what was expected from him about himself, if you want, because the protagonist of the story is somewhat based on the same Count of Champagne, at least because there is a sort of inversion in the story, let's say, with the one of the Count, because the story is about a young prince that was son of the Emperor of Constantinople that goes into the West to ask King Arthur to give to him the knightly sword, right? So to dub him, and this is naturally, the story is kind of complex. The romance is usually split in two, structurally speaking, as all the works of Chrétien, and this presents a first part that deals with the adventures of Cligès parents, that are Alexander Sardamar, and the second part that is instead about the adventures of the protagonist Cligès. And the romance has been always considered in opposition to the history of Tristan and Iseult, from which Chrétien was definitely influenced. And the author of the romance, in fact, takes from the story of Tristan some certain aspects by offering different solutions and ending, actually, because in opposition to the theme of the adulterer's love sung in that work, for example, and eventually, Chrétien de Troyes had a massive echo in medieval literature, and it was even the inspiration of the Philocolus by Boccaccio, for example. And the plot is complex, as we were saying. There is a Greek emperor, Alexander, that decides to be dumped by Arthur, as we've said, and then after having helped him to overthrow an usurper, he marries Sardamar, which is Arthur's niece, and from their union is born a son, Cligès. And Alexander, with his own bride and his own son, comes back for some time after in Greece, where Cligès is educated, when he grows old, and after the death of his own parents, Cligès becomes knight for his uncle Alice, or Ali, if you want, that he became emperor of Constantinople. So Alice decides to marry the daughter of the German emperor named Phenice, and Cligès at that point is part of that group of knights that is entrusted with the task of searching searching for Phenice, actually, and in the process, naturally, Cligès falls in love with her. So Phenice responds to his love, and both of them, after through many adventures, etc., adversities, for example, there is the fact that Phenice is liberated, then there is the fight against the Saxons, the fake death of Phenice that we were talking about before, and that they hide, right, because of course Cligès didn't want his uncle to marry her, to marry Phenice, and they are discovered, actually, and that's when they decide to go to the court of King Arthur, and there they learn about the death of Alice, and that allows them eventually to come back to Greece, where Cligès is crowned, and he marries Phenice, right? So this is kind of even typical, happy endings are kind of disgusting. I don't know, I never liked them in literature, but the story is beautiful, of course, and I think it's greatly, we are still massively influenced by these very traditions in here. Not even the previous ones, the one we think about Arthurian legend, the actual origins of it, but much of the mythology of the legend that has been reformulated into this high medieval, say, low medieval contexts. So why is that today we talk about this specifically, and we read a passage, right? Because we want to talk about tournaments, right? We want to talk about this tournament that Cligès, as we will see now, takes part to in England, and he does. It's also, he's spotted by Arthur, etc. He fights against all of these Arthurian knights of the Round Table, etc. This is the context, right? But what is fascinating, in fact, is what is being written here by an author of the 12th century that knows about courtly, let's say knightly culture of his times, and therefore tries also to satisfy his literary taste by depicting a tournament for what, not for what it actually was, never think about that, but what it should have been in theory, right? But still adding a lot of details that are nevertheless very interesting about especially the sense of pride and honor that revolved around tournaments. First of all, we have to understand here that war is a game. It's a sport for nobles. And when we think about tournaments, especially in the 12th century, first of all, we have to set things very straight here. First of all, in the 12th century, there is nothing like what would become, like starting from 14th century Italy, you know, the joust with the fence separating, you know, the knights, all the ritualization spreads all over Europe, and most of tournaments that we think of today are some of, you know, iconically some of the very end of the Middle Ages, like for the 15th or even the 16th century. Many of them even armor that we are from that very, you know, from the early modern age even, and tournaments are something that are extremely interesting to follow historically speaking, because through their evolution you can understand a lot really about the political and military culture of the elites and also the evolution of the state, etc. But when we talk about the 12th century, and I can't stress this enough, tournaments were literally not like war. I mean, they were exactly the same thing. Many people don't know this, but it's actually this way. I mean, what was done in tournaments was basically the same identical thing was done in war, right? At least for what concerns knightly clashes, right? Now, I don't want to open too many digressions because the video is probably going to be very long already by itself. But you have to set this clear. The tournaments were organized like in wide plains, were even populated by, you know, by peasants, by farmers, etc. The knights went there. There were these bands of thugs, because that's what in the 12th century they were, and clashing for the sense of honor and pride of betting. You know, the papacy tended to stop this because it was actually a very violent business. People died in here, even by a game. You know, this was a war game, which people died on a regular basis, but not more nor less than in real warfare, because real warfare was the same identical thing. And you would say, well, but maybe in tournaments there were certain rules about this. Well, yes, because there were in war too at the time, and especially in this second half of the 12th century. You know, think about all the great knights of this age. Think about, Richard Lionheart, William Marshall, or Frederick I Barbarossa, or Philip II Augustus. So here's the great, arguably, debatably, you know, the moment of greater glory of the knight on the battlefield, and especially in this area of France and England, that so feudalism spreading at its let's say at its fullest, this an unchallenged prevalence of heavy cavalry on the field, right? Even in the 13th century, that is objectively the apex of feudal political and military culture in itself, still you find something else that is changing. So this second half of the 12th century is extremely important to observe what also because it's kind of better documented from previous times, but something similar was happening also before. But this is a very important moment of coincidences that allow us to understand better what it kind of was like to be a knight conceptually in this still kind of old moment. You know, still the 12th century is the moment of greatest growth, arguably, of the European system. from the very roots, but it's kind of a primitive world. Here there are areas of Europe that are also pretty close to these events that are yet to be, civilized, literally. I mean, not mean the making the quest of a civilizer here in the sense of, let's butcher pagans in the Baltic or something like that, but just think about Germany. Germany at this time didn't quite have a real feudalism like France had. There was still savage, wild, even certain areas of France were, even certain areas of England, and this world was, now we know what happened later, but think about coming from this world was. I think we discussed this extensively in other videos, what the psychology, the mindset of this knights actually was, and it's kind of disturbing also to analyze for what we know about it, because given their lifestyle, their education, their growth, it was deeply traumatic, and I actually, sometimes you hear people around it depicting this as a kind of a positive world where everything was cool, the old times when the Europeans were brave and pure. This was a world of it was a nightmare, telling the truth. If we were to judge it from our own standards, not because it was better or worse than other places, but knightly, courtly, and ideals, and the fact that we still believe in them are actually a pretty effective mean to compensate, to exercise what was actually happening, that we see that was happening in reality, right? It's important when reading these works not to fall into the trap of thinking that it was, first of all, I mean, it's more subtle than this. Obviously, these are idealized works, but you can still read a lot through them, as we were saying before, that even in the ideal can make you see an aspect of reality that was actually like that, knowing that it wasn't just the only one, right? We could make a video one day to in which we can rationalize these ideals, like in understanding what the other face was, but the fact that probably that half was still existing in some measure, and there is a bit of truth in all of this. And the sense of chivalric pride and honor was deeply felt, because it really corresponded to certain political and social dynamics that had produced, in fact, this kind of literature and culture broadly meant. But tournaments were cruel, were objectively cruel, and then not just among the knights that always came out of some broken bone and sometimes, some killed. But also for the people that were involved into this, in the sense that during tournaments, knights usually pillaged the local peasantry, for example. They destroyed, they smashed, they set on fire, and all this type of violence that you can think of. And let's say, for what concerns the game of war, here we see the fiction and the stylization, say, right? But at the same time, we do realize that complementarily there is the seriousness in the front of what was instead felt, and especially from our own side, could be understood as a chance of having fun, of entertainment. Nights were cool things you would like to get into if you were a knight yourself. Given your standards of life, what you did for a living, and it was a great moment of self-promotion. The seriousness of the tournament entailed, in fact, the idea that you were gambling, just like in war, your own reputation, your own future, your own fortune, even your own health. And as we have seen, not that rarely, your own life, right? And this is interesting because I don't want to make some trivial considerations, but such, anthropologically speaking, such things still exist. I mean, young people, young males usually do this. Like, we do have this idea that, getting into a fight is a kind of exciting, right? This is something you can't think when you're kind of from 14 to 20, right? And then you start getting a bit wiser. But this was effectively a battleground, even for the unexperienced. The tournaments served exactly to this purpose. I mean, to the fact that even young knights had to learn how to fight, and these were situations that were basically simulating exactly what war was, but still in a way that was a bit more relatively more controlled, but relatively, and I suppose actually it doesn't even make sense to make a distinction, right? But the idea is that you could practice in this sense also in time, and this is probably the most important thing, also in time of peace, right? War was endemic at this point, but there would be different situations, right? Here, monarchies, especially between France and England, still have developed at a level for which there are, imposing campaigns into thinking about the clash between the English and the French. It's kind of anachronistic to put it in these terms, and also kind of mistaken, but the clash between the Angevins and the Carpathians into France, into Western France, these were massive wars. They required a lot of things, including money, as always, and therefore crowned monarchies financing. That we made a lot of videos about these issues. Just recently, we made a video about the Brabançons, for example, just seeing this military professionalism that entailed the participation of people who fought sometimes, from a non-nobiliar background, but they were being skilled as noblemen in practice. And this proves you how war was becoming kind of more dangerous for the same knights that it had been before, that is often overlooked in this sense. So the tournament was assuming, even conceptually, this symbolism of a kind of a more chivalric, aristocratic business, for which participating to it was kind of a sort of status matter, or at least this time it was still very fluid, because it was still a place where you could make social promotion of yourself. But there is this tendency towards also the increased regulation at one point. And also, what is important, as I was saying before, is that there is no social mobility, right? There was still the perception that the tournament could be a training ground for knights at all times. Like, tournaments were big events, also economically speaking, not just for the bets that revolve around them, but of course that wherever these knights went, aside from, of course, I give you kind of a terroristic picture of the thing, but not all knight, like let's say the presence of knights entailed in general, in spite of the distractions that could also bring to, because these knights were free from doing what hell they wanted. There were no tanks around. They were the tanks of the time. And, if there are, I don't know, just 40 knights covered in mail from head to toe, like, you can't stop them, if not with other knights. And knights cost, and just monarchies usually can do, and not even monarchies sometimes can stop them everywhere, right? So, but the knight, in fact, think about his own equipment. It was enormously expensive. That tells you also the degree of elite of these individuals, and someone had to produce that. Someone had to, think about horse breeders as well. Think of all the economy or the spin-off that gravitated around this. And the more war there was, and naturally, the more this business was fueled, right? And sometimes we say, oh yeah, it's the usual thing. The rich, the few rich guys will do wars in the expense of all the poor people because they want to make money of it. It's not really like that. To reduce politics, war, and society to that is radically naive and actually historically incorrect. But aside from that, it's obvious that there was, in fact, in this sense, a huge part of society that also benefited from war. war, from war benefited a lot of non-nobles as well, middle classes especially, but even the peasantry in part, because the development of feudalism was also bringing to a sort of pacification, paradoxically, right? So there is always this, the more society gets structured in feudalism, the more there is order, objectively, over chaos. So even depicting, the 12th century is the moment in which the great feudal monarchies are being born, are being structured properly. We made some videos about this, about Germany, about France, especially about England. We made it about England too. And there is a playlist for all these regions on Schwerpunkt you can check during the Middle Ages. So war is an instrument, as we have seen extensively enough during our von Clausewitz series, and as such it has to be understood. We can't stress just the bad side of the stories, have to observe the positive sides, right? And understand that war is not bad or good by itself inherently. It's politics that uses it as a tool. So war doesn't have any fault in its own. People have, and their mind have, but war is in itself, actually, in medieval times, not even an extremely, war was literally the worst that could happen to you. The mortality was pretty high for a series of many reasons, and especially among knights. Okay, the peasantry suffered the most of it, of course, so it was terrible, but even among knights, mortality wasn't that high. Because here the crossbow is slowly still, is rising, but is not mainstream everywhere. At least apparently, at least not with its power, but especially not because of the political and social power of the middle classes, lower classes. But also in this sense, the knightly elite mostly fought for ransom, for capturing and ransoming. In fact, now we will see it as well in the passage. Yet, as we understood, chivalric era is a time of war, and after all, maybe not very, cruel, but not very gory for those who participated to it, especially from the knightly perspective. But from the other side, you find these games, these warrior games, let's say, in peacetime, that instead are atrocious and bloody, right? So it's fascinating to notice this paradox, in part, this contrast. And if war is a courtly tournament, the tournament is war. As we've seen, maybe and not even déguisé, right? Not regulated, not kind of very readdressed, reformulated in substance, right? It has its own heroes, it has its own professionals, and therefore now it's worthy to enjoy this rather long page of what at this point is, in fact, one of the necessary authors on these topics, if you really want to understand the great and moving Chrétien. Right, so now we will be reading this passage in English, of course, and after that we will comment it, right? Alright, so, and Cligès has crossed the sea and has come to Wallingford. There he has demeaned himself in lordly fashion in a fine lodging at a great cost, but he thinks ever of Venice, right? Never does he forget her for an hour. In the place where he sojourns and tarries, his retinue, as he had commanded, have inquired and questioned persistently till they heard told and related that the barons of King Arthur and the king himself in person had set on foot a tournament in the plains before Oxford, which is near Wallingford. In such wise was the joust arranged that it was to last 4 days. But Cligès will be able to take time to arm his body if he lacks anything meanwhile, for there were more than 15 whole days to the tournament. he speedily sends 3 of his squires to London, and bids them buy 3 different sets of armor, one black, another red, the third green. And as they return, he bids that each set of arms be covered with new canvas, so that if anyone meets them on the way, he may not know what will be the hue of the arms which they will bring. The squires now set out London, and find ready all such equipment as they seek. Soon had they finished, soon did they return. They have come back as soon as they could. They showed to Cligès the arms that they had brought, and he praises them much. With these that the emperor gave him on the Danube, when he dubbed him knight, he has them stored away and hidden. If anyone now were to ask me why he had them stored away, I would not answer him, for in due time it will be told and related to you, when all the high barons of the land who will come there to gain fame will be mounted on their steeds. On the day that was devised and appointed, the barons of renown assemble. King Arthur, together with the lords whom he had chosen from out the good knights, lay before Oxford. Towards Wallingford went the greater part of his chivalry. Think not that I tell you in order to spin out my tale. Such and such kings were there, such and such counts, and such others. When the barons were to meet, a knight of great prowess of King Arthur's peers rode out all alone between the 2 ranks to begin the tourney, as was the custom at the time. But none dares ride forward to come and joust against him. There is none who does not stay where he is, and yet there are some who ask, why do these knights wait? Why does none ride forth from the ranks? Surely someone will straightway begin, and on the other side they say, See ye not what champion our adversaries have sent us from their side? Let him who has not yet known it know that of the 4 bravest known, this is a pillar equal to the rest. Who is he then? See ye him not? It is Sagramore, the lawless. Is it he? Truly without doubt. Cligès, who hears and hearkens to this, sat on Morel, and had armor blacker than a ripe mulberry. His whole armor was black. He separates himself from the other in the rank and spurs Morel, who comes out of the row. Not one is there who sees him, but says to his neighbor, This man rides well with feathered lance. Here have we a very skilful knight. He bears his arms in the right fashion. Well does the shield at his neck become him. But one cannot but told him mad as regards the joust he has undertaken of his own account against one of the bravest known in all this land. But who is he? Of what land he is a native? Who knows him? Not I, nor I. But no snow has fallen on him. Rather is his armor blacker than monks' or priests' cape. Thus they engage in gossip, and the 2 champions let their horses go, for no longer do they delay, because right eager and aflame are they for the encounter and the shock. Cligès strikes so that he presses Sagramore's shield to his arm, and his arm to his body. Sagramore falls at a full length. Cligès acts irreproachably and makes him declare himself prisoner. Sagramore gives his parole. Now the fight begins, and they charge in rivalry. Cligès has rushed to the combat and goes seeking joust and encounter. He encounters no knight whom he does not take or lay low. On both sides he wins the highest distinction, for where he rides to joust, he brings the whole tourney to a standstill. Yet he who gallops up to the joust with him is not without great prowess. but he wins more renown for standing his ground against Cligès than for taking prisoner another knight. And if Cligès leads him away captive, yet he enjoys great distinction for merely daring to withstand him in the joust. Cligès has the praise and distinction of the whole tournament, and even secretly he has returned to his lodging so that none of them might accost him about one thing or another. And in case anyone should have search made for the lodging marked by the black arms, he locks them up in a room so that they may neither be found nor seen, and he has the green arms openly displayed at the door, fronting the roads so that the passers-by shall see them. And if any asks for him and seeks him, he will not know where his lodging will be, since he will see no sign of the black shield that he seeks. Thus Cligès is in the town, and hides himself by such a device, and those who were his prisoners went from end to end of the town, asking for the Black Knight. But none could tell them where he was, and even King Arthur sends up and down to seek him. But all say, "We did not see him after we left the tourney, and know not what became of him. More than 20 youths whom the king has sent seek him, but Cligès has so utterly blotted out his tracks that they find no sign of him." King Arthur crosses himself when it was recounted and told him that neither great nor small is found who can put out his dwelling any more than if he were at Caesarea, or at Toledo, or in Candia. "Faith," quoted he, "I know not what say in the matter, but I marvel greatly thereat. It was perhaps a ghost that has moved along us. Many a knight has he overthrown today, and he bears away the parole of the noblest man we will not this year see home or land or country, and each of whom will have broken his oath." Thus the king spake his pleasure, though he might very well have kept silence in the matter. Much have all the barons spoken that night of the Black Knight, for they spoke of naught else. On the morrow they returned to arms, all without summons and without entreaty. Lancelot of the Lake has dashed forth to make the first joust, for no coward is he. With upright lance he awaits the joust. Lo! Cligès, greener than meadow grass, galloping on a dun, long-maned steed. Where Cligès pricks on the tawny steed, there is none, whether decked with youth's luxuriant locks of bald, who does not behold him with wonder, and they say on both sides, "This man is in all respect much nobler and more skilful than he of yesterday with the black arms, just as the pine is fairer than the beech, and the laurel than the elder." But not yet have learned who he of yesterday was. But we will learn this very day who this one is. If anyone know it, let him tell us. Each said, "I know him not, never did I see him before to my thinking, but he is fairer than the knight of yesterday, and fairer than Lancelot of the Lake. If he were arrayed in a sack and Lancelot in silver and gold, yet this man would still be fairer." Thus all side with Cligès, and the two prick their steeds, and as fast as they can spur and encounter one another. Cligès proceeds to deal such a blow on the golden shield with the painted lion that he hurls its bearer from the saddle and fell him in order to receive his submission. Lancelot could not defend himself and has given his parole. Then the noise and din and the crash of lances has begun. Those who were on Cligès' side have all their trust in him, for he won his for he whom he strikes, after due challenge given, will never be so strong but that he must needs fall from his horse to the ground. Cligès this day rode so bravely and threw down and captured so many that he has pleased those on his side twice as much, and has had twice as much praise from them as he had the day before. When evening has come, he has repaired to his lodging as quickly as he could, and speedily bids the red shield and the other armour be brought forth. He orders that the arms which he bore that day be stowed away. The landlord has carefully done it. Long have the knights whom he had captured sought him that night again, but no news do they hear of him. The greater part of those who speak of him at the inns laud and praise him. Next day the knights return arms, alert and strong, from the array before Oxford rides out of a knight of greater renown. Percival the Welshman was he called. As soon as Cligès saw him ride forth and heard the truth as to his name, for he heard him called Percival, he greatly longs to encounter him. Forthwith has he ridden forth from the rank on a sorrel Spanish steed, and his armour was red. Then they, one and all, regard him with great wonder, more than they ever did before, and say that never before did they see so comely a knight. And the two prick forward at once, for there was no delay, and the one and the other's person so that they give and take mighty blows on their shields. The lances, which were short and thick, bend and curve. In the sight of all who were looking on, Cligès has struck Percival, so that he smites him down from his horse and makes him give parole without much fighting and without great ado. When Percival had submitted, then they have begun the tourney, and they all encounter together. Cligès encounters no knight, but he fells him to the ground. On this day one could not see him a single hour absent from the fight. Each for himself strikes a blow at Cligès at a tower. Not merely 2 or 3 strike, for then was not the use custom. Cligès has made an anvil of his shield, for all played smith and hammer upon it and cleave a quarter it. But none strikes upon it, but Cligès pays him back, and throws him from his stirrups and saddle. And no one, except a man who wished to lie, could have said on his departure that the knight with the red shield had not won that wold day. And the best and most courteous would fain have his acquaintances, but that cannot be soon, for he has gone away secretly when he saw that the sun had set, and he has had his red shield and all his other armour taken away. And he has the white arms brought in which he had been newly knighted, and the arms and the steed were placed in front of the door. But now they begin to perceive, for a greater part who speak of it say so, and perceive it to be so, that they have all been discomfited and put to flight by a single man, who each day changes his outward show, both horse and armour, and seems another than himself. They have now for the first time perceived it, and my Lord Gawain has said that never before did they see such a jouster. And because he would fain have his acquaintance and known his name, he says that he will be first tomorrow at the encounter of the knights. But he makes no boast, rather he says that he thinks and believes that Cligès will have the best of it and will win the renown when they strike with lances. But with the sword perhaps Cligès will not be his master, for never could Gawain find his master. Now will he prove himself tomorrow on the strange night, for every day dons different armour and changes horse and harness. Soon he will be a bird of many moultings, if thus daily he makes a practice of taking off his old feathers and putting on new ones. And thus Gawain too doffed his armour and put on other, and the morrow he sees Cligès return, whiter than the lily flower, his shield held by the straps behind him, on his trust, white Arab steed, as he had devised the night before. Gawain, the valiant, the renowned, has not gone to sleep on the field, but pricks and spurs and advances, and puts forth all his utmost force to joust well, if he finds any with whom to joust. Soon both will be on the field, for Cligès had no wish to delay, for he had heard murmur of those who say, "It is Gawain, who is no weakling afoot or on horseback. It is he with whom none dares to measure himself." Cligès, who hears the words, charges into the middle of the field towards him. Both advance and encounter with a spring more swift than that of a stag, who hears the baying of dogs barking after him. The lances strike on the shields, and so mightily is the crash of the blows that to their very ends they shatter into splinters and split and go to pieces, and the saddle bows behind break. Moreover, the saddle girth and breast harness burst. They both alike fall to the ground, and have drawn their naked swords. The folk have pressed round to behold the battle. King Arthur came in front of all to separate and reconcile them, but they had broken and hewn in pieces the wide hauberks, and had cleft through and cut up the shields, and had fractured the helmet before there was any talk of peace. The king had gazed at them as long a time as it pleased him, and so did many of the others, who said that they esteemed the White Knight no whit less in arms than my lord Gawain, and up till now they could not say which was the better, which the worse, nor which would overcome the other if they were allowed to fight till the battle was fought out. But it does not please or suit the king that they do more than they have done. He advances to part them, and says to them, "Withdraw. If another blow be struck, it will be to your harm. But make peace, be friends. Fair nephew of Gawain, I entreat you, for it does not become a valiant man to continue a battle or fight where he has no quarrel or hatred. But if this knight would come to my court to pass his time with us, it would be no grievance or hurt to him. Pray him to do so, nephew." "Willingly, sire." Cligès seeks not to excuse himself from this. Willingly he consents to go thither when the tourney shall end, for now he has carried out to the uttermost his father's command, and the king says that he cares not for a tournament which lasts long. Well may they straightway leave it. The knights have dispersed, for the king wishes and commands it. Cligès sends for all his armour, for it behoves him to follow the king. With all speed he may have, he comes to the court, but he was never attired well beforehand, and garbed after the French fashion. As soon as he came to court, each hastens to meet him, for neither one nor the other remains behind. Rather they manifest the greatest possible joy and festivity, and all those whom he had taken into jousting acclaim him lord. But it is in his wish to disclaim it to all of them, and he says that if they think and believe that it was he who took them, they are all absolved of their pledge. There is not a single one who did not say, "It was you, well we know it, we prize highly your acquaintance, and much ought we to love you, and esteem you, and acclaim you, Lord, for none of us is a match for you." Just as the sun puts out the little stars, so their light is not visible in the clouds where the rays of the sun to shine forth, so our deeds pale and wane before yours, and yet our deeds were wont to be greatly renowned throughout the world. Cligès knows what reply to make to them, for it seems to him that one and all of them praise him more than they ought. Though it is very pleasant to him, yet he is ashamed of it. The blood rises into his face, so that they see him all ashamed. They escort him through the hall, and have led him before the king, but they all cease to address him the language of praise and flattery. Now was it set hour for eating, and those whose business it was hastened to set the tables. They have set tables in the palace, some have taken napkins, and others hold basins and give water to those who come. All have washed, and all are seated. The king has taken Cligès by the hand and set him before him. For fain will he know this very day, for he is, if at all he may. No need is there to speak of the food, for the dishes were as plentiful as though one could have purchased an ox for a farthing. So in here we find plenty of potential food for thought and consideration about chivalric culture, right? First of all, you can see this kind of international dimension of the fight, right? Of course, here it's King Arthur and it's in Britain, and but the idea that there is a great tournament that the king has set, it's something that spreads far and wide. Everybody wants to come now. Cligès has come across sea, right, to Wallingford, and that's where he actually knows that the tournament has been indicted, let's say, and therefore you understand here the organization, the fact that the king had chosen a specific place where to enact the tournament is also very important, because also relatively to what we were saying before about the potential, like local economy, etc. That there were naturally the lands where tournaments took place were usually private lands, right? That would be a nobleman who would say, okay, I will allow you to do this on my land, and this was a way to appear, to shine in front of the king, etc. Because objectively was a cost. Even the same, there was a sort of, it was a business in itself. They would try to profit anyway, but it's obvious that there was an organization behind this that costed initially. So it was a massive investment, theoretically also a risk, and this is how largely even monarchies started to expand their clienteles, because nobody theoretically had to do this, but since knights would do it anyway, it was better to organize it, as king, right? This is what would actually happen, aside from the fictional character of Arthur, in wars like those, right? And what I forgot to say before, by the way, is that not just we have tendentially in the collective imaginative this kind of more later idea, like for us, knights are fundamentally one of 15th century plate armor, right? It also depends on the countries, probably. I think in the Anglosphere, that's the Middle Ages, right? Because that's where, for historiographical and culture reasons, from the same Middle Ages to contemporary era, that has been celebrated. I presume for French, the true Middle Ages are like the 13th century. For others, it's different moments. It all depends, right? But the concept here is we have to think it like 12th century, and think as if this was a fictional story taking place in the 12th century, like in a fictional world, but still at the 12th century times. That's the idea. Because these people didn't have really a notion of time as of the various eras as we do, like in a kind of a progressive dimension. Here there was a continuity, a linearity, of course, that derived from the Christian measuring of time that we still have. But the idea of moving, of progress in a world where the crop rates were astonishingly low, it was not even perceived that there would be a change. It was a world that looked at itself largely as unmoving, or at least they knew it was changing, but still for kind of relatively small aspects of the whole story, while there were kind of still deeper thoughts and ideals and dynamics that remained at the base of it. So this works, albeit being part of a an elitary environment, we're still somewhat the reflection, even of people who had objectively very clear, let's say surely clearer than a peasant would have, that how the world was changing, right? Because from a peasant perspective, they didn't care anything about but their land, rightfully, because they had to survive in there. These guys were doing more. These people were organizing crusades and waging wars and laws about building castles. They had a more concrete, let's say, a broad horizon than the other classes, even than the clergy, for example. These were the great doers, the great builders, makers, fighters of the world at the time, right? So what is interesting, I think it's the preparation also, and the fact of that there is still enough time. So Cligès has a following, has a retinue, and he sends his squires to London. Interestingly enough, so here Chrétien de Troyes was thinking that the London of the 12th century objectively was of course the most important center, and kind of a place where you could find armor, full armor, right? Thinking armor at this time is essentially the coat of mail with the helmet, right? And of course in gambeson and all, but you'd say the metal parts are relatively non-composed, like the later set of plates, and it all is complicated. But it's beautiful here and absolutely real, the fact that these armors were all colored, right? We tend to think that armor was substantially, metal gray. The concept here is quite the opposite. I mean, I'm not 100% sure that all armor were colored. I don't think so. Consider that some of them were black, as a matter of fact, because they were brownished, right? Or they were burnished actually because of polishing it and preserving it from rust. So that's how it would be. But the elite knights definitely had colored, painted armor, and this is widely known. Even later times in plate armor, you find that were, they were painted. There was varnish on it. These colors were the most different. In fact, here we see black, red, green, eventually white, white, really white. So this is even more interesting because think about how it reflected light and so on. But we know, in fact, of gilded, like of golden, silver, all colors you can imagine. And because, of course, this armor was worn under a surcoat, it also, had the emblems of the various knights, lineages, and so on. So this was very important. It was a great visual show. There is, very few things are so colored and visually spectacular from this point of view, like a medieval battle, right? The colors everywhere, like literally everywhere. It was a big deal. It had it was not just a problem of distinguish one another in worlds that, in this sense, were maybe even too colored, in the sense that you couldn't learn by heart literally every single emblem or flag that was out there. So actually these armies were pretty heterogeneously looking in that sense, but rather it's a matter of it's a psychological reason. It's the fact that we do know behaviorally that if we wear certain particular colors, we tend to behave differently. Wearing blue is kind of more serious, etc. Wearing red is very, makes you more vital, more aggressive, and more energetic, and so on. So all these colors naturally corresponded to different symbols and ideals, and they had a meaning that we partly have lost because we can't presume of also all the superstitions and beliefs, and you can see it from essentially even from heraldry. How strange apparently certain symbols or animals or other entities was, but if you think at it in perspective, it's not really a big deal, because if you get to know the story behind those symbols, you realize why such things were in that way, and you also understand why they were so important to them. It was not just a decoration, it was literally embodying yourself into that symbol on the battlefield. So it's quite a big deal, and showing off with these colors and being spotted. By the way, in the ideal military culture of courtly models, the the knight was searching to be recognized, right? In this case, it's different because here in the tournament, he wants to show off because Cligès wants to say make people wonder who he is, and kind of proving that the fact that he's maybe not interested even to be recognized because he's even ashamed of this the recognition. He just wants to go there and create this magic. That there is also this spell around the fact that the guy is unknown, was this person in fact is mistaken for his black knight, and then is the green one, etc. But on a battlefield, it was a matter of enormous pride to be recognized with your own insignia, by your own insignia, and to stand out, right? Even the various other decoration, for example, like the crests that embodied entire symbols, very often the same ones of the emblems of the coat of arms, was a way, first of all, to look taller and therefore more imposing, more menacing, but also to be recognized, like to say, I recognize that guy. That's something that disappears actually only very late in time in military history. It's with rifled guns fundamentally that this is over, because before rifled guns the importance was not even properly aiming but just firing straight at a mass of enemies, and that's how it worked. With rifle guns you can start taking down one by one, because you're gonna hit where you shoot, and therefore being spotted starts being a problem because you would die. And so in the Middle Ages instead, where basically where armor are bulletproof, right? There is no, like, you can say pretty easily that up to the 16th century, basically, at least the best armor available was perfectly functional against every type of muscular force projectile, aside from like things like batteries, like, I don't know, stone throwers and stuff like that. But you know what I mean. I mean, crossbows were fundamentally incapable of piercing through plate armor. That develops when crossbows develop. Gambison is an extremely thick thing. Even cuts, it's pretty damn good. So you can say Middle Ages, everything was countered by. This didn't mean that maybe a splinter or something couldn't enter and kill you, whatever. This happened, as a matter of fact. In fact, the eye slits on the helmets were kind of a very weak point, were also reinforced for the same reason, because at that point the knights had to watch, and in fact they started enclosing their helmet, especially in this period, and maybe a bit later, because cavalry warfare was increasing so much that this couché, lance grip, and coordinated cavalry charges were hitting straight, frontally, always more precisely at the face, right? So they had to close the helmet, which before hadn't been the case, historically speaking. So these things are all technical, but there is also the idea that the individualism is important, that guy is still a warrior. He's not a disciplined soldier. He is a warrior, has to prove this innate qualities of his spirit, his mind, his instinct, that also derive from a stock, like the idea that these lineages, especially in countries like France, in England, they felt to be kind of racially superior to the other classes. They believed they were tougher and stronger. They came from stocks that were of great warriors, great, and this reflects the importance of still the individual. Even things like physical prowess, right, mattered. Like, not like in 2 centuries where just one peasant can kill a knight. In theory, en masse, theoretically could still happen. It's even if infantry victories here in this period are non-existent against cavalry, still these guys, and from the way they behaved, we do know pretty well that they were pretty fearful of peasants. Yeah, if they were caught alone in the open, it happened pretty often. Even during these tournaments of moments in which they were raiding and pillaging, they were scattered around the territory. It did happen very often, actually. Peasants surrounded these guys and knocked them down. by, they were so heavy, always their armor, etc., and they could remain stuck under their horses that normally weren't armored at this time. So yeah, I'm going by approximation, but that's really how it was. What is cool about, let's say, we can see here is how there were several knights here that seemed to play, literally to play, that is to fight at the same time. And what is fascinating about this is it seems from the stories that as if there were multiple, there were several ranks, right? Like in a real battle here, there were squads basically. And so we don't get an enormous deal of details here, and the whole thing revolves around individual, at single combats basically, duels. And this is also an idea, a cliche about the ideal, what theoretically knightly warfare had to be about. It was echoing heroic warfare that actually never existed in the history of mankind, because there was something we can't call like that, but it was still with these guys, these champions being surrounded by other fighters of lesser ground, whatever, individually inferior but still supporting him, right? So in real battle, the tournament was, if you want, a moment where there was a much greater expectation posed on you. What is very interesting about this red is how all the crowd, starting from the knights actually to what was watching, and the king also was expecting a lot from these people. I mean, this was the ideal ground for showing off, which is what in war was a bit more difficult to do. In fact, that's why tournaments, by certain standards, could possibly even more violent, right? Because there was a much more, more violent for the individual soldier, because for the individual knight, let's say proper here, now the individual soldier, war was bloodier, but for the knight, maybe not on average. And on average, because it was still quite violent, but during the tournament it was you versus another in front of lots of people who counted a freaking lot politically, socially. So there were big prizes as well. As we've seen, this was a chance of social promotion and etc. So these guys were more determined, and everybody was looking at these guys. It's funny how Chrétien here introduces this direct speech, exclusively, I think, if I'm not wrong, about... Okay, well, no, but usually about the crowd, however. The crowd here is a non-specified people talking about this guy's fight. And everybody is amazed. What they're looking at is how good the fighter is. It was a moment in which the actual fighting techniques mattered a lot, because it was theoretically a more ritualized fight, and it was easier to follow, right? So the tournament here was really about this challenge, this technical individual challenge, about also physical prowess, because the individuality of it was all what this thing was based for, especially when if it was a real entertainment even for other people. Like there were certain tournaments that were, as we were saying before, much less regulated. They were really about just pillaging around and making a mess. Usually they chose to huts or farms where they would preside, and they had to conquer each other. So and everything in between was destroyed as a consequence, including private property. So it was messed up. Here, the whole tournament in Chrétien's work, this scene is also idealized, right? But such tournaments did exist already, right? With the idea that like with the king, with the dames looking at. It was a real thing, but it was at very high levels. Nevertheless, exactly because it was at very high levels, that probably was the place where the individual was more highlighted in his abilities. So he arrives and everybody starts murmuring, who is this guy? He's so cool, because he's starting to defeat everyone. And this is important. It tells a nice thing about the fight. He at this point it was a kind of kite shield used, and here says that the shield brought to his neck very closely, and that was a true matter of defense. And because the kite shield is kind of enveloping tendentially. Towards the 13th century would get smaller, especially also because leg armor would increase, etc. But it was technically for protecting your chest and arm, and then bringing it to your neck, or even up to in front of your face, just at the level of your eyes, because that is kind of safe to do. Some of these shields were even tied, as you know, to the arm, to the chest. It was a highly technical and technically refined business, the one of fighting. Reenactors, they can do it, can understand it pretty well, because they in fact are the ones who really get closer to this challenge, right? They don't probably have the same feelings of hatred and social competition, etc., that bring to fanatic conclusions. But if you look at even, especially seemingly in Russia and in Poland, medieval reenactors seemingly do that. They actually are violent. Like, there are always ambulances in there because people get wounded. And as albeit it's not probably that violent as these tournaments were, because these were rough things, that can give you an idea. And these fights, by the way, were fairly, here the Chrétien talks about ranks, which makes me think that it was like, in fact, there were ranks proper. And as you know, fighting is exhausting. Like, after 2 or 3 minutes, you're exhausted. And that's why all fights in history, including the ones with formations, were actually pretty... They literally lasted like 2 minutes, and then the ranks would distantiate from one another, would start just harassing them with projectiles. And this is how battles throughout all the history of mankind literally were before, firearms. And it is really what it is. It's exactly like that. You don't have to think about something extremely refined in open field. Here in the tournament, it sounds more like, and it's funny here because there is one voice saying, there is one knight that has to start at one point, that has to somewhat, we have to start this fight, which means that probably nobody wanted, maybe because in these ranks even, more people would fight at once. But the idea is that one knight would go out and fight against the others, and this is, and for a few minutes, and then coming back, hopefully against another guy from the others. But if you know how fighting is even in actual warfare, and I stressed this before, that this was like warfare for real, is that there is always one kind of fanatic, less disciplined, but probably individually superior fighter that gets into this very risky situation of getting out of his own ranks and attacking the enemy. And maybe frontal is not a big deal because the guy is probably very hyped and loaded and extremely violent, and he knows how to attack. The problem is when he has to come back. That's probably, during actual fighting, one of the riskiest moments ever, like where you turn your back and you can easily be attacked by someone who can hit you, and that happens, right? So these fights were probably much less disordered than we expect, but probably, as we said, more we rose into the hierarchy and more It was about the individual and the, technical refinedness of the fight. They were very muscular, tough, violent things. People broke their broke their bones. Sometimes they died. I mean, it's pretty damn easy, especially at this time with this male, like in Gambes, etc., getting internal trauma bleeding from the inside, especially in your head. That's why helmets were technically plate armor, like unlike the rest of the armor. They had Gambes and Quaff underneath, and but if you break something some vessel into your brain, you can easily bleed out. You have a cerebral hemorrhage, and you're done for, right? And also cuts were very nasty, especially for they got infected, septicemia, and all this stuff. But for that reason, these guys were so well protected. In fact, if you really think about the knightly armor this time, everything was revolving around avoiding cuts, right? Mail is excellent for against cuts. Even Gambizon is pretty damn thick. If your blade is not sharp enough in certain peculiar ways, you can't cut in it. Don't think that's because it's organic you can't cut through it. It doesn't work like that at all. That's what Gambizon was basically universal, and also expansive. By the way, some of these guys used silk, for example, in order to. But this is not just in medieval Europe. Take Japan, what samurais were, and this is pretty kind of shared, universal shared problems at the time. Instead, internal trauma was, in order to bleed someone to death from the inner, from the within, is, you really have to traumatize it extremely heavily. Like, I think this would happen mostly during the charges, something like that. For the rest, you could break his arms, his ribs, etc. But at the time, orthopedy was basically the only branch of medicine that actually worked, because it's essentially a mechanical thing. All the rest sucked for our own modern medicine standards, but orthopedy, was a thing. Albeit, I always wonder how they put all these guys together. Right? We know that there were people that fought in a lifetime of tournaments and war, like up to 80 years old. They were on saddle, and you can imagine which part of their, which bone of their body wasn't broken in the process. And there had to be a lot of lame and crippled people out there because of war, right? And this is tragic because objectively, the worst when you can't move a limb either, and you're done for it in part. But these guys were so much about the actual aggressiveness of their mindset that they probably fought anyway. We know King John of Bohemia of Luxembourg in the 14th century. He died at Crécy, fighting, albeit he was blind. In the thick of the mist, of the melee, and that was quite a thing. For example, so that tells you how this chivalric idea of participating to the fight, of getting in there, was the real deal. It was like the most wished and awaited thing ever. And it's fascinating because if you think of what the reality of warfare was at the time, most of these knights would basically die of septicemia into a ditch in their own, don't make me say things like pretty lame deaths, like just maybe because they got infected. Just look at how Richard Lionheart died. I mean, man, that sucked. Aside from pitched battles that were pretty damn rare, that would be the massive events that would be celebrated and sung and remembered, etc. That was the greatest dream of every knight, to die and to participate. Maybe not to die, but to survive. But if you really had to die, that would have been the best, right? And the other chance was tournaments, because at least tournaments were a moment, especially these most refined ones to objectively die in a more honorable way. Let's say someone that at least in a way that would remember you. Like being killed by a crossbowman recruited from the peasantry in a siege into a place nobody would go was not a good way to die for a knight, right? It was a shame, actually. So here's all the story that Cligès mounts. He changes mounts. He switches mounts as well during the days. He changes armor, and he uses this other. There are Spanish steed, an Arab steed. I made a video recently about the horses of Crusaders and Reconquista knights, which is titled Crusaders and Reconquista Horses Dispelling the Myth of Poor Western Mounts. That is very interesting. So here's these mounts were both Arab and Western and Eastern breeds were actually pretty good in both regards, and it all depended on which horses they were. As always, it's like the sword, right? We have this idea that the swords, for example, or armor, were like produced like in the Middle Ages were all good. Well, actually, no. Maybe one was good out of 10. The rest was lame. It was discarded or sold away for very cheaply. But that tent, that was made in a way that not even with our modern technology we can balance and make effective the way we do. Like we can do now incredible things with metals that at the time we couldn't even not even dream of. But still, they could do swords that were as good as, better than what we can ever be able to dream to do, right? To make. So that's very meaningful. The same was for horses. There were horses better, other worse, of course. Horses weren't handmade, but they were still bred. Breeding horses is kind of an art in part, and these horses were pretty prized. The Spanish, the Arab, etc. What else can we say? Here there is a part that says Cligès has gone into the thick of the mist. The mist of the melee. Right? Why do I say the mist? I don't know. Sorry. Of the melee, and he's seeking for a fight, for a duel. Right? And he basically wins at every level, right? In all the fields against all these people, and it's a big deal. It's probably exaggerated. Nobody did. Here, the picture is very ideal, as you understand once again, and it's aimed at celebrating this ideal night that everybody would have liked to have. What does this mean? Well, it means that every night was kind of probably a great part of this night's discussions, aside from war, was what had been the best night in that tournament. It's like when you stop by in a bar and you hear guys talking about football, and everybody seemed to have an opinion, right, about that. And these were probably the same thing. And what everybody was searching was for the best match, right, the best players. That's exactly what these tournaments were. So here Cligès is embodying in Chrétien's mind the greatest model ever possible, conceivable, right? He's the great hero, and he has all the pride and the glory of the world tournament. And this is naturally unrealistic because who is the guy you can't find that can defeat anyone? Even if he was actually the best one, but surely he could be defeated. We have seen it in von Clausewitz so many times that you can. This is actual war don't get me wrong, this is still war. This fits the Krieg actually pretty well, because yeah, you can be the best guy around, and still a lot of these fights can be about individual prowess, but it's not that you have to win all the time. These are things that happen only into these romances, right? And that's what it is. A myth, in a legend, that's exactly what we mean. So, in the meanwhile, everybody is wondering what this guy is. That they have started realizing that he is, even though he changes armor and horse every day, that he's actually the same person. And even the king starts to send out informers, spies, etc., to find out who he is, where he comes from, and so on. And this is a big deal, because here the king immediately, what the king wants is to take this guy among his own knights. That's the real deal, and that's about that social promotion we were talking about before. Like, tournaments were in fact, a testing ground for the knights, and therefore the great employers of war, right, the great businessmen of war, chiefly the monarchies that had all the interest to having the best knights, went there to search for the knight who could serve him, could serve them, and that was that's also why there was a kind of a royal organization of this stuff, because that was done in grand style, and all the best knights would participate. There would be more competition, selection would be tougher. So the best really emerged, and this is important. Now, maybe it's not really so mathematical as we've seen before. In a way, these tournaments were the ruin, even possibly of extremely talented knights who could easily die or crippled, taken out, knocked out during the same tournament. So that's why also all this sense of pride and honor, because everything was at stake. And it was exactly the feeling of honor and pride that countered fear, etc., because this rendered possible the selection as such, and therefore the improvement of the system overall. It's interesting also this line in which King Arthur has sent the spies out to search for this guy, and he says that it couldn't be found, as if he had come from places like Caesarea, Toledo, and Candia. So here is literally Turkey, Spain, and Greece, and it's interesting how in the 12th century this French poet was seeing these as the borders of, literally of Christianity, right? Because Candia was, at least at this point, was in Crete it was Christian, but it was kind of the last outpost, because south down in Mediterranean would be the Muslims. Caesarea was in the eastern, in the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia. Toledo was Spanish, and yet to be conquered, actually. If I'm not wrong, I don't actually know. It was conquered exactly around this time, and yeah, right. So those are beyond that. Sunt leones, we could say, that we don't know what's out there. It's as if those were the limits of the same Christianity. And interestingly, King Arthur makes the cross sign on himself, like, who is this guy? They start thinking he's spelled, that there is something wrong with here, because he's literally the best of all, and he is starting ruining a lot of people in the process. So this is a big deal. So here you see that here naturally Chrétien is going beyond. Like, even Arthur now has this guy. Cligès is not part of the traditional, story of Arthur. So this is kind of an extraneous. It's Chrétien has invented a lot, and added a lot, and transformed the stories, like in a way that they weren't before. But this adds to the exaggeration, to the fact that this knight was so good that not even King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, that were kind of the best guys ever, could match, or even find out what it is. Which in the Arthurian cycle, as you know, think about the Lohengrin, all the story of Parsifal, etc. That there was this idea of the supernatural, this sublime, and of the unknown, of the magic, of certain limits that had the Graal, right? That's the real deal. So it's something that goes beyond the same Christian and pagan tradition into the sublime, into the greatness, into the absolute, into this so high and great model that everybody should be fearful of whoever comes close to it, because he's the chosen one, is to do great things in his life. So I think this was very very important, and he starts defeating Lancelot, and so other great champion, as you know, and Percival and Gawain, right? So these are literally the best knights around. And at the end, we don't recount all the stories. I'm just pointing out the fact that he continues going on defeating everyone, and all the better warriors start challenging him, and he defeats them. Gawain actually gets not defeated because Arthur intervenes, right? Gawain says, this guy's the best with lance and horseback, but when we pass to the swords, maybe it's not the case. So they start fighting, and they can't beat each other. And Arthur stops, says, okay, now you have to be friends. He recognized them as peers. Gawain, his Arthur's nephew, and etc. So here, it's also a matter of stock, of lineage. Like, this is royalty, right? So for the Count of Champagne's perspective, he being equated to a king's lineage in terms of power was a big deal. This is the hidden meaning behind it, and yet there is an alliance in this sense. These are recognized as peers, and therefore they share this aristocratic feelings that had formed chivalry as we know it, in the sense that chivalry had been born largely, like in terms of political and military terms of professionalism, etc., during the 10th century. I mean, the cultural roots are millenary, and we discussed them in Schwerpunkt extensively. We keep discussing them extensively. But after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, that also had been, the time of great heroes, the great knights, etc., these guys, without a strong central authority, they start taking matters in their own hands, and they start developing Europe-wide this sense of belonging, essentially to a same class, right? The military class, the class of the milites in Latin, the knights, that can fight, and they do fight, because there is always a good reason for doing it, given that everything is so politically fragmented, everything is so unstable. There is no way to counter, like to have a real order in the process. But that at the same time, they recognize there's their shared superiority over the other classes, and start developing this shared military culture, and ethos, and idea that they were better than anyone else. They were people of an extreme arrogance and presumption, and sense of superiority, and they were objectively the strongest people around. They were needed to be courageous and effective. Like these tournaments were created to assess exactly that. I mean, being called a coward in this context and getting this name was like a tragedy, was a real tragedy in the sense nobody would care about you at that point. It's as we've seen, it was a matter of social promotion. It seems a great deal also. The whole thing here, we didn't stress it because actually the cliche is a love history, as we recognized before. Here, love was dealt in angelic terms, like Phoenice, this loved dame that she's also forbidden in a certain sense. Here, actually, in cliche, the history ends well, but in other times it doesn't. Even in the Arthurian cycle, it normally doesn't. And it's the idea that these knights actually could make a fortune by marrying a powerful woman that was usually a heiress, because knights usually married. I mean, actually, the most powerful lords usually married quite young women on average. Okay, many women would actually die in childbirth, and that was a massive problem, as you know. So they would remarry, and they would grow old, and they would marry kind of very young women. Like normally they were like 12, 14. As soon as they became fertile, time was pretty short and fragile. So that's where they started to make children normally. And but these younger knights, especially the poorer ones, those who had maybe arisen through the ranks, they weren't even noblemen, usually tried to marry maybe not the most noble, but at least the richest heiresses. So these women that maybe they had married a lord that was 20 years older than them, and this lord died, right? And they were still young, and they wanted to marry again. So these tournaments, all the story of being in love with these women and fighting for them, right? Some were forbidden loves. There is also, in fact, in Arthurian cycles, all this idea of whose land is. Think about Guinevere and Lancelot. That's kind of the most famous example. This fact of you're in love with your boss wife, because that technically what it was. These lords had beautiful, rich wives, and the knights were totally in love with them. So they would try to impress them. Also because they lived close to them in their husbands' retinues, right, in the castle or maybe around. They met in some way. So the tournament, of course, the most ritualized ones were a moment to show off. All the symbolism. The dame's napkin that was wrapped around the legs, all these things. And it was a real deal, and of course it was very shaded, but seemingly really a big deal of the fortune of political fortune these knights was making the right marriage, right? And in fact, this courtly literature is very ambiguous in some ways, because from one side we know, there was this angelic theory, all because there was also the problem of the lineage. Like, you couldn't be unfaithful even if they wanted to be, because in a world where dynasties are rising fastly, the idea that a woman could get pregnant with a lover meant by right that was a sin. First of all, could be punishable with death, but secondly, that the children would be born weren't legitimately the Lord's son. There's also an ambiguity, for example, and we know actually that instead the reality of sexual customs was much more libertine, but very much more libertine. We think that these were, there were extreme. The Middle Ages are a moment of great extreme. We know that there was a vernacular poetry about sex, was extremely explicit, and some of the greatest workers that we also remember for kind of pious works. Thinking about Dante, right? They wrote pornography. Porno, literature. I don't know how to say that. Erotic literature, and it was extremely explicit. Homosexuality also was a thing, actually. It's widely renowned, at least in every time it is, or this kind of monosexual communities like knights, etc. In fact, also they came. There was also this ritual of passage with young children. Of course, they would start being the squires of the knights. Homosexuality was a thing. We also had at a king's level sometimes. The word is sometimes actually today they seem so strange, and we think they were homosexuality, but it was something different in some cases. Like it was like this idea of brotherhood. This idea is of also as the brotherhood and a spirit of corps that does exist among the military today. And that in fact, think of all the old jokes with sailors that were, for this kind of homosexual environment, because in part it is true, but it also stems from this great trust that you have on your fellow comrade, what you risk life with, and you have to share a lot with, and these things happen, but they weren't homosexuality all the time. It was even a way to prove the same brotherhood. But these were things, even for example in the 16th century, figures like Francis I or Charles V, the most powerful sovereigns in Europe, they considered themselves as kind of brothers. They slept together at one point, of course not sexually, but it's still a pretty intimate thing to do. And think also about the general psyche of these people. These people were traumatized by some most atrocious types of violence committed on them, and that they committed on others. And this life in which people died from a moment to another, that's something you have to cope with psychologically speaking. So the relations, the affections, the feelings of these people were something undescribable today, where we have a much more kind of tranquil life. We can orientate ourselves more rationally. And those times, these people didn't even know what the world was like. They believed in ghosts, in spirits. There was a big deal of fear and uncertainty, and these stories, by the way, were quite important because they made sense in their own mind. I'd say they had a meaning that wasn't just merely about here the tournament, but about this fact of being, of getting, for example, glory. What is that remains if you died in that world? It's that people will tell your stories. That was an important thing. Having died without being recognized at this great night was a tragedy. Nobody wished it to be, but it happened dramatically often. So that's why this literary model was stressing so much these this greatness, in this case a cliche, etc. And talking about love again, thinking that this guy, it's very moving at the beginning. He says before this tournament he was going there for Fenice, for his beloved one. And Fenice, it's for anyone who has been in love, you know what it means when you stop. You would do anything for this person. You would think her all the time. And there is a beautiful, in the Dubliners, there is by Joyce, there is that line. I don't remember. I think that boy was working in a circus, and he falls in love with that an older girl that was working there as well. And at one point he says that is beautiful to read, because he brought like a glass of water to her, and he thought like he was bringing the Graal to her. So it makes me think about this Arthurian cycle here because of the Graal and all surrounding. And this idea that these women were really the engine that would make the whole thing work. Like, what are you fighting for? Fighting for, let's not use the bad word, you're fighting for your woman. for the woman you love, ideally even, right? Courtly love is platonic, theoretically. Then these people went, they had prostitutes, they went, they raped, it was the world that it was, but the ideal was important. Think about this is very important, the importance of the mother and the sisters. Think about being taken away from your household when you are 70 years old because you have to go under someone some night to become a squire at 70 years old, and you're taken away from your own mother. And you think maybe you have seen your younger sisters already maybe being married, some forcibly. We know that a lot of girls actually preferred monastic life to this forced choices, and that maybe would die during the delivery. Think about in the memory of this young boys, how the memory of the mother and what it was when these courtly romances that were sung. By the way, this stuff was sung and told by these poets and singers, etc. At the courts. You could imagine these knights were capable, literally, because we know it happened to resources extensively, butchering children. They could be called a stone in that sense. They were extremely competitive, ferocious, arrogant, violent. They would break up in tears at reading the description of these female figures that recalled to them evidently what they had lost forever when they were brought forcibly into that life, that however was a life, and this is what I always write to remember, that was shaping the world at the time, also in a civilized manner, right? Because through these monarchies, through these feudal regimes, was being born what would become later on the Europe that we know. And it's tough to talk about these topics because it sounds as if we want to make a history of costumes, or no, these are the deeper veins of what those worlds were, and this is fantastic. Also, coming back on the topic of masculinity here, you would think these guys were kind of cocky and haha, yeah, I'm the great knight. Instead, what this guy does is that he is actually, all the knights go to him and say, oh, you're so cool, you're the best, you're like, we're just small stars and you're the sun, you're the counts. And this guy, instead of, he said, Chrétien says, he was happy, but he blushed, and he felt ashamed. Now, this is very fascinating because objectively, even think of it in our world, what is the hero that cries or that feels shame or gets red? That sounds kind of like an effeminate, right? At that time, this sensitivity was perceived in part like saying, I don't know, it's as if the angelic figures, this sharp contrast with reality of people were extremely brutal and cold, completely messed up psychologically speaking. Finding this kind of pure individual that maintained this sensitivity in front of extreme radical and extreme violence carried out daily in war and even in these in tournaments was considered like a miracle, and it was in fact the symbol of this absolute ideal of the of a knighthood, but also of Christianity. Think about the virginity. Virginity was considered. Think about all the military saints of this in these models. There is all the idea that you can even think about the Percival, the Lohengrin, that they go close even to achieving, to take their woman, but eventually something breaks the spell, and everything is lost forever. I mean, this idea of sexuality that is somewhat borderline in some aspects is important, right? And because it was the sublimation of certain feelings that were so distant from reality, evidently, that appeared as miraculous, and what everybody kind of maybe felt like it would be cool to reach for, kind of in terms of moral integrity, because these guys, like, at least in theory, were supposed to be perfect Christians. Instead, we know that, aside from being, it's not that they weren't perfect Christians, because, perfect Christians do not sin. That's not the point. All Christians sin, by definition. Otherwise, they wouldn't be Christians. They wouldn't know the Bible, for that matter. But they were not Christians in the sense that they actually believed in Christ, etc. But they still had a kind of a contractualist view of the world. I mean, we know it extensively by an incredible amount of sources. These people believed that praying God equated to getting victory. Like, the more you pray, the more you fasted. Think about all the dubbing ceremony, what it meant, abstinence in a single world, from eating, from from any kind of bodily thing, and instead it was the contrast. And even here, it's fascinating, because it may appear trivial how it ends, about the banquet. Right, about all the food that is served here. Also, food at the time was a big deal. Here, Cligès wins. He's invited by Arthur at the banquet with all the other knights. So he gets it's like 5 stars restaurant together with the king and the knights, with important people, right? And here, we're in the 12th century. The 12th century, as we mentioned before, it's a time of growth, but economy is still largely natural. With barter, like monies, exists, etc. But it's not. It's still a poor world, where even, a big animal that is being hunted down is a huge asset. In these special occasions, they would butcher the best animals. They would serve the largest fish, and all this juicy stuff that, objectively, it's also a good reason to fight for. Together. So food, sex, and that's essentially what it is from one side. But also being recognized as, being that you can deserve that just because also you're morally and spiritually superior in theory, which is also an ideal, because here just the most powerful people got this stuff independently of whether we're good or not, or bad. But I think these topics are very fascinating, because they show you, they make you grow closer to what I was thinking about today when I plan to read this. I must be honest, I don't like very much these stories, right? In terms of literary taste, like, I love, for example, the Minnesänger. I like chivalry. There is a courtly literature that I do like, but certain of it, and in part this one, is kind of cheesy, right? I don't know how to say that. I feel it's like all this ideal, pure stuff is, if it is highly poetical and it's maybe mixed with sounds and visions, and it's something. And here it's reflected like that, but it still makes me feel, I don't know, it's uncomfortable to read at some points. Like, for example, when you see this guy, everybody cheers, and we want to be, you're so good. Like, I don't like that. I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe because I'm misanthropic, or whatever. But it doesn't belong to me as ethically. I think, but it's still important to read this, and I do know that to many people these things make a strange effect, because today we have very different morals, or at least we are in a world that considers other things to be important. We actually have a lot of things that stems from chivalry still today. I mean, if you want to be gallant with women, or you want to make them sit on the bus, for example, that's something I do willingly if I can. nobody pays me for that. It's not that I expect anything from those women specifically, but for doing that. But I feel it's right, and I feel I should do it, right? And I do realize that it's strange, but at the same time, it solves a kind of a social function that even still today is important. Like when maybe that woman smiles to me and tells me, well, thank you very much, and you understand she's honest, and you see maybe that she really deserves that as a person. I do feel well, and maybe just because because I'm male and she's female, and I think it does exist, this relation, naturally speaking, for which the man has to provide for the woman instinctively, right? So that's good, and I do recognize it as good. But our stuff here is, I don't know, it's in this story at least, seems more than, it seems irrational, and in part we have erased let's say this the sense of the need for such things, like or remember, maybe the understanding for the effectiveness of such things. And that's why, in order to understand them, we have to deepen and dig into the historical background of these stories. Because if you don't understand how messed up these people were, psychologically speaking, you can't understand these works that were written supposedly for them. So that's why it makes you feel strange, because objectively this is a story that to us in part, unfortunately, doesn't make sense anymore. But still, aside from this as well, you can see, maybe not in here of course in here extensively as well, but not maybe intensively, certain other aspects of the story. Like, do you remember those military details, for example, we stated here? Well, they do emerge. This is a text written in the 12th century. And from it, we do get this technicism that, although the work is very idealistic, it still works. It makes this technical details still appear, because evidently they were so important that these knights basically couldn't do without them. And a history like this would sound incomplete without them. But that's essentially where you should start also to investigate more concretely in these terms. In fact, I don't like... there is certain literature I like, other that I... But when it comes to history proper, it's always as if there was a patina that is in this text that is preventing you to see clearly from underneath it, that you should be striving to do. And it's kind of a obsession for rationalization, in my opinion, that we do have, but that we need at one point, because we need certainties. Like, it's like today is the month in which I make battles reconstruction, and in there it's the same thing. You read these sources, they're maybe more technical, more chronistic, and you realize that you are interpreting these sources with a need for rationalizing them at a point that maybe you even go against the intention of the same source, right? You want to create a pattern that is kind of rational and makes you interpret these battles in a coherent way, but most of the times I think the best exercise is simply saying, okay, we don't know, you should take these pieces of literature for what they are, without too many pretenses about the irrational into it, or at least understanding through their irrational how rational they are. And especially understanding at that point that this is a tool. Like, what you're reading here, what this is really about is a is an instrument. Like, these stories were written to please, in this sense, the nobility, some of the highest nobles of France, and seeing it like what a poet would do for a living in the second half of the 12th century. And I realize it's difficult, and I still have some perplexities that eventually were expressed now in this video, relatively to my own difficulty, actually, too, because I'm not a literature expert, but I do like to see these stories in what we can learn about through them that makes sense. That makes sense into what we know about all the rest, right? Not just about from literature, because if we were to be based exclusively on literature, we would have a irrealistic picture. This is not a real picture, what happened, but still you can find by these exaggerations a lot of meaning of what these guys were wishing reality should be, and it wasn't, right? Alright, so I presume this is everything. And of course we'll keep talking about these topics, because I think knighthood and chivalry are quite important. Like, they talk to at a deep level to us, even if we don't really we have difficulties to take this thing from our ancestral memory to really rationalize and to try to understand better. But still, it adds a little brick again to this building of medieval knighthood that we're starting to build in here, right, on Schwerpunkt. Alright, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time. Bye.